They called him a ghost, a man so invisible, the FBI spent 17 years chasing shadows. But on June 22, 1993, when a package exploded in a California home, a chilling truth surfaced: he wasn't gone. He was watching, waiting, perfecting his bombs. And this time, he wasn't playing games. Dr. Charles Epstein never expected to become part of American criminal history. That warm summer day, he came home to find an anonymous package waiting in his mailbox. No return address, no warning, just a box with his name on it. Curious, he mentioned it briefly to his wife and daughter before retreating into his study. A soft chuckle, a crackling sound, and then chaos. The explosion tore through his peaceful suburban home, shattering windows and silence. Dr. Epstein survived, but barely. 2 days later, a second bomb went off, this time at Yale University, injuring Professor David Giller. Both victims were highly respected academics. The message was loud, precise, and terrifying. The Unabomber had returned. But who was he really? Before the headlines, before the manhunt, before the manifesto, there was just Ted. Born in 1942 in Chicago to a modest Polish-American family, Fyodor Kaczynski was no ordinary child. By the time he was 6, his brilliance was impossible to ignore. He spoke with the logic of an adult and solved mathematical problems with eerie ease. His parents, seeing the spark of genius, did what most would: pushed him harder. They accelerated his education, skipping him ahead 2 full grades. But brilliance has a cost. Ted, always the youngest in class, grew up surrounded by kids who didn't understand him and didn't want to. He was intellectually intimidating and socially isolated. Friends were few, but he had one person who always stuck by him: his younger brother David. They were inseparable, partners in curiosity and play. But even that wouldn't last. By age 16, Ted was off to Harvard on a full scholarship. Imagine that. Just a teenager, barely out of boyhood, walking the halls of one of the most prestigious universities in the world. But Harvard didn't feel like a victory. It felt like exile. Ted didn't fit in, not with the wealthy legacy kids, not with the professors who saw him as a curiosity. He wrote home frequently, blaming his mother for the pressure, the loneliness, the disconnect from normal life. Still, his academic fire never dimmed. He finished his undergraduate degree with honors, then earned a PhD in mathematics from the University of Michigan. His thesis was so advanced, only a handful of mathematicians in the world could even understand it. At 25, he became one of the youngest professors at UC Berkeley. But something didn't sit right. Ted quit his job after just 2 years. No explanation, no scandal, just silence. He vanished from the academic world as suddenly as he'd entered it. But this wasn't retirement, it was rebellion. Ted wasn't just leaving the profession, he was leaving society. He bought a plot of land deep in the Montana wilderness and built a tiny cabin. No running water, no electricity, no phone, no neighbors, just trees, silence, and the crackle of his growing rage. He believed technology was enslaving humanity, that every new device stole a piece of freedom, that the modern world was an illusion of progress built on dependency. He wrote about these ideas obsessively, crafting them into journals, manifestos, even coded diaries. He wasn't just venting, he was plotting. David, still devoted to his brother, helped him build the cabin. For a while, they kept in touch. But distance, both physical and emotional, grew. A fight over a woman, one Ted had fallen for at a Chicago factory, fractured their bond. When the woman rejected him, Ted left a trail of vicious poems throughout the factory. David, appalled, fired him. After that, Ted returned to the forest and never looked back. He stopped writing, stopped visiting. To the outside world, Ted Kaczynski ceased to exist. But inside that cabin, something darker was brewing. Years passed. He scouted targets, read scientific journals at the local library, and studied chemistry from borrowed books. When his savings ran out, he took odd jobs, fixing bicycles, chopping wood. He stole metal scraps from sheds, bits of wire, batteries, matchsticks. All of it had one purpose: bombs. May 25, 1978. Northwestern University, Chicago. A strange package appeared in the parking lot. It was addressed to Professor Buckley Christ, but it never made it to him. A campus security guard found it and, thinking it was misdelivered, tried to open it. The bomb exploded in his hands. The injuries were minor. The device primitive: matchsticks, black powder, and a wooden box. But the message was unmistakable. Someone had declared war. Someone meticulous, patient, and learning. A year later, it happened again. Same university, same crude design. This time, a student found the package and suffered burns when it detonated. Still, no pattern was detected. The bombs were too weak, the attacks too far apart. Investigators chalked it up to isolated incidents. But Ted wasn't done. He was experimenting, taking notes, improving. His diary, written entirely in numbers, hid pages of thoughts and ambitions. Each number corresponded to a word, a sentence, an idea. In it, he wrote, "I wish the explosion had blinded the victim or blown off his hands. I will learn more and make better bombs." He did. November 15th, 1979. An American Airlines flight lifts off from Chicago. Among its cargo, a ticking package. The bomb explodes midair in the cargo hold. Smoke fills the cabin. Panic spreads. The pilot makes an emergency landing. No one dies, but that's pure luck. The FBI is called in. This isn't vandalism. This is terrorism. They examine the debris, the wooden casing, the altimeter trigger. It was designed to detonate at a specific altitude. They now knew the bomber didn't just want to harm people. He wanted mass casualties. They also knew something else. Whoever built this had scientific training. Still, no suspect. No fingerprints. No trail. June 10th, 1980. Percy Wood, president of United Airlines, receives a package. Inside, a book. The note says it contains revolutionary ideas. When he opens it, the explosion nearly kills him. The book was hollowed out, filled with wires and shrapnel. This time, investigators find something. A metal fragment with the letters FC etched into it. Freedom Club. It was the bomber's signature. A calling card. A challenge. Then he vanished. For a year. Then 2. People assumed he'd been arrested or killed. But Ted was still in the woods, testing new explosives, refining his formula. Townspeople reported strange booms in the forest. No one knew they were hearing practice runs for murder. Then, October 8th, 1981, he resurfaced. At the University of Utah, someone finds a suspicious package. It doesn't detonate. The FBI is called in, and, for the first time, they have an unexploded bomb to study. Inside, a pipe bomb next to a container of gasoline. The intention was horrifying: blast and burn. Again, no fingerprints, no hairs, no DNA, just silence and steel. May 5th, 1982. Another bomb. Another university. Vanderbilt this time. The note inside reads, "Woo, it works. I told you it would. RV." The FBI knows it's fake. A diversion. But they still spend months chasing leads, checking every woo and every RV in the country. The bomber was toying with them. But even Ted felt the sting of failure. His journal from that time reads, "It's very frustrating that I can't build a truly lethal bomb." So he disappeared again for 3 years. During that time, he wasn't idle. In the woods, he fought a personal war. A local sawmill annoyed him with its noise and smoke, so he sabotaged it, pouring sand into its engine. Bikers roared through his trails, so he broke into their cabin and destroyed everything, even leaving human waste behind as a final insult. Ted had become a phantom, a force of rage with no name. But he wasn't finished. May 15th, 1985. The University of California, Berkeley, where Ted once taught. A student finds a device in the engineering department. It explodes in his hands. He loses 4 fingers. His arm is torn open. A month later, a package arrives at Boeing's Washington headquarters. Employees suspect it's a bomb. They're right. The FBI disarms it. Inside, once again, are the initials FC. November 15th, 1985. The University of Michigan. A package addressed to Professor James McConnell. He opens the letter while his assistant opens the box. It explodes. The assistant is seriously injured. McConnell suffers hearing loss. But why McConnell? He wasn't a tech researcher. He was a psychologist. Only years later would the FBI learn the truth. McConnell had once treated Ted and tried to medicate him. Ted never forgave him. Less than a month later, December 11th, 1985, Ted places a bomb behind a computer store in Sacramento. The owner, Hugh Scruton, picks it up. It explodes. He dies instantly. The first fatality. Ted writes in his journal, "Excellent. The bomb finally achieved its purpose." For the FBI, the nightmare was just beginning. They thought he was finished. After the first death, The FBI hoped the Unabomber might lay low. But what they didn't understand was that this kill, was exactly what he'd been chasing all along. It was confirmation. His twisted theory had finally been proven, not with math, not with a lecture, but with a life cut short. And once Ted Kaczynski crossed that threshold, there was no going back. Just 2 months after Hugh Scruton was killed, on February 20th, 1987, a new target emerged, a computer store in Salt Lake City. A different city, but the same weapon. The bomb was placed outside, near the store's front door. A woman inside the shop noticed a man acting strangely. Hoodie pulled low, sunglasses, placing something near the cars. It was odd, but not threatening. Certainly not suspicious enough to call police. An hour later, the store owner, Gary Wright, stepped outside to throw out the trash. That's when he noticed the strange box and, just like the victim before him, reached down to inspect it. The explosion tore through him. Nails and metal fragments shredded the lower half of his body. Somehow he survived, but he would never be the same again. Several fingers were gone. His muscles were mangled. His life permanently altered by a man he'd never met. And Ted? He watched from the shadows, not literally, but emotionally, tracking the media reports, the FBI statements, the growing panic. But something wasn't right. In his journal, he wrote, "The bomb detonated well, but the result was unsatisfactory. It hadn't killed. And worse, for the first time, someone had seen him. The woman at the shop had remembered his face. She worked with police to develop a composite sketch. Angular features, thick mustache, hooded sweatshirt, aviator glasses. The image spread like wildfire. For the first time in over a decade of destruction, the Unabomber had a face. And he knew it. Ted panicked, not with screaming or flailing, but with silence. Cold, calculated silence. He vanished again, disappeared back into the forest like a ghost sinking into the soil. For 6 years, nothing happened. No bombings, no letters, no headlines. And just like before, the FBI began to wonder. Had he died? Was he jailed on an unrelated charge? Had he finally retired into oblivion? But Ted wasn't gone. He was waiting and writing. In the cramped shadows of his Montana cabin, he typed with obsessive precision. Thoughts poured from his mind into pages. A philosophy, a declaration, a warning. He called it Industrial Society and its future, but the world would come to know it by another name. The Unabomber Manifesto. Ted believed modern life was a trap, that technology had hijacked human freedom and turned society into a machine. The bombs, those were just punctuation marks. The real weapon was his message. And when he came back, he didn't ease in. June 22nd, 1993, Dr. Charles Epstein, a geneticist in California, found a small package in his mailbox. No return address. But that wasn't unusual. Scientists got weird mail all the time. Books, letters, sometimes gifts from grateful students. He even joked with his wife about it. Moments later, the house shook. The explosion blew off 3 of Epstein's fingers, shattered his eardrums, and left him barely clinging to life. Just 2 days later, another bomb arrived, this time at Yale. Professor David Gelernter, a brilliant computer scientist, opened it himself. The explosion ravaged his hand, damaged his eyesight, and almost killed him. 2 attacks, back to back. The FBI had never seen that before. The Unabomber wasn't just back. He was louder, stronger, and more confident than ever. This wasn't a man running from fear. This was a man preparing for war. And then, something unexpected happened. The New York Times received a letter, postmarked before the bombings. The writer identified themselves as part of an anarchist group called FC, Freedom Club. But the FBI already knew those initials. They had been carved into his bombs for years. It was him. For the first time, the Unabomber reached out directly. He wanted to talk. The letter wasn't long, but it included something chilling. A number, 553,254,394. It was a secret code, a way to verify future communications. No one else knew it. Not the public, not the press, only the FBI. And now, the Times. The message was clear. He was serious, and he was ready to explain. But it wouldn't be in whispers. It would be in a book. Over the next year, no new bombs arrived. But another package did. Inside was a 56-page typed manuscript. It was dense, academic, and terrifying. He sent copies to both the New York Times and the Washington Post, along with a condition: publish this document, and I'll stop the bombings. At first, The FBI hesitated. Should they really give a terrorist a platform? But then, a new fear emerged. What if publishing it stopped the killings? And so, on September 19, 1995, the Washington Post printed the full manifesto. The country was transfixed. But in one quiet home in upstate New York, something else happened. Something the FBI never expected. A woman named Linda Kaczynski read the manifesto with growing dread. She had never met her husband's older brother Ted. He had cut off contact years earlier, retreating into the forest like a ghost. But as she read, a chill ran through her. The words, the tone, the ideas, they were too familiar. She turned to her husband, David, and asked the unthinkable, "Have you read this?" He hadn't, but when he did, his face changed. Line by line, paragraph by paragraph, the memories came flooding back. Letters from Ted, pages of philosophical rants, hatred for technology, bitter screeds about the modern world. They matched the manifesto word for word. David was horrified. Could his own brother, the boy he'd grown up with, the genius he'd admired, be the most wanted terrorist in American history? They began comparing the manifesto with old letters. They retrieved more from David's mother. And the truth became impossible to ignore. Ted wasn't just similar. He was the author. But knowing wasn't enough. Reporting, that was the hard part. David wrestled with it for days. If he stayed silent and someone else died, their blood would be on his hands. But if he came forward, he would be turning in his own brother. Finally, he picked up the phone and called the FBI's tip line. At first, nothing happened. The FBI was drowning in leads. Over 2,400 suspects. Ted was buried near the bottom. Weeks passed. David called again, insisting they read the letters. Finally, someone listened. An agent reviewed the documents, compared them to the manifesto, and his jaw dropped. It was a match. Immediately, Ted Kaczynski became the prime suspect in the largest domestic terrorism investigation in U.S. history. But suspicion wasn't enough. They needed proof. And they knew exactly where it might be, his cabin. The FBI sent agents to Lincoln, Montana, to scope it out. Locals confirmed Ted hadn't been seen in a while. That wasn't unusual. He was known to vanish for months. But this time, the stakes were higher. On April 3, 1996, a team surrounded the cabin. But they didn't storm it. They had a different plan. They brought in Jerry Burns, a forest officer who knew Ted. Jerry walked up to the door with two plainclothes agents and shouted, "Hey Ted, got some guys here asking about drilling rights. Can we talk?" Ted opened the door, cautious but calm. He turned to grab his shoes, and that's when the agents pounced. They tackled him, cuffed him, and read his rights. The ghost had finally been captured. Inside the cabin, the FBI found everything they needed: bomb components, writings, drawings, tools. Even the very typewriter used to write the manifesto. One agent pulled a small box from under the bed. Something about it felt wrong. He gently set it down and backed away. It was a live bomb, fully functional. One wrong move, and it could have been the final chapter of the case. Instead, it was the beginning of the end. The media exploded. Ted's face was everywhere. The Unabomber was no longer a mystery. He was a man, a brother, a professor, a loner with scars no one could see. But the story doesn't end there. Because behind the trial, behind the cameras and courtrooms, something even darker was brewing. Something buried in Ted's past. Something that might explain how a genius child prodigy transformed into a mass-murdering terrorist. When the FBI dragged Ted Kaczynski from his cabin in 1996, they didn't just arrest a terrorist. They unearthed a time bomb, one they didn't even know they had built. To the public, he was now a man with a name, a face, and a crime scene stacked with bomb parts and manifestos. But behind the headlines, behind the courtroom doors and media firestorms, lay something far more disturbing. Because Ted Kaczynski hadn't just snapped. He had been made. Let's rewind. Back to 1958. Ted was just 16 years old when he arrived at Harvard University, a boy genius stepping into the most prestigious campus in America. But if he thought he was walking into greatness, he was wrong. He was walking into a trap. At Harvard, he was chosen, handpicked, even for a psychological study. That's how they described it. A prestigious opportunity for gifted students to participate in cutting-edge behavioral research. Ted signed up. Why wouldn't he? He craved intellectual stimulation, respect, belonging. But what he got instead was psychological warfare. The man running the study was Dr. Henry Murray, a decorated Harvard psychologist with a warm smile and deep connections to U.S. intelligence. Unknown to his students, unknown even to most of the university, Murray was working with the CIA. The program? A classified government project called MKUltra. Its goal? Mind control, psychological breakdown, brainwashing. What Ted thought would be a standard psychological test became a systematic attack on his mind. Week after week, he was brought into a small room, strapped to a chair, and hooked up to monitoring devices. Then, the interrogation began. Murray, once warm and friendly, turned cold and clinical. He launched brutal verbal assaults on Ted's beliefs, his thoughts, his fears, his philosophies. He played recordings of Ted's own words from earlier sessions, twisted, edited, mocked in front of panels of observers. He told Ted his ideas were childish, that his mind was broken, that his convictions were pathetic, and all of it, every second, was monitored, measured, recorded. Imagine it. A 16-year-old boy, isolated and brilliant, subjected to calculated emotional destruction by men twice his age wearing lab coats and hidden agendas. It didn't just humiliate Ted, it reprogrammed him. He stopped trusting people, stopped believing in connection, in institutions, in anything but his own internal logic. And buried inside that logic, a new voice began to grow. A darker one. This wasn't therapy. It was psychological crucifixion. Years later, when MKUltra was exposed and declassified, the world learned the truth. These weren't isolated cases. They were widespread government experiments, tested on civilians, students, even hospital patients without consent. Some subjects suffered permanent psychosis. Others committed suicide. Ted survived, but he didn't come out whole. Fast forward to his trial. The defense team, desperate to save him from the death penalty, tried to use the Harvard experiments as evidence of insanity. They argued he had been a weapon manufactured by the U.S. government itself, that he was a product of abuse masquerading as science. They wanted him labeled insane. But Ted refused. He fought his own lawyers tooth and nail. Not because he didn't believe the experiments had affected him, but because he refused to let his ideas be dismissed as the ravings of a madman. To him, insanity was a cop-out. He wasn't delusional. He had a message, and bombs were the only language people listened to. So when his lawyers lied, when they claimed to be defending him one way but were secretly pushing the insanity plea, Ted snapped. In court, he begged the judge to remove his legal team and let him represent himself. The judge refused. Ted fell into despair. He stopped eating, attempted suicide in his cell. He was forcibly hospitalized, then returned to solitary confinement. Eventually, the prosecution offered a deal, confessed to every bombing, plead guilty, and in exchange, they'd take the death penalty off the table. Ted agreed, not because he was afraid to die, but because he had one final wish, that his ideas would survive, even if he didn't. He was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole, and sent to ADX Florence, the most secure prison in America, a place known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies, home to El Chapo, the Oklahoma City bomber, and the 9/11 conspirators. There, Ted lived in silence. No visitors, no face-to-face conversations, no yard time with other inmates. Just him, his books, and the sound of his own thoughts bouncing off concrete walls. But he kept writing. Letters, essays, philosophical reflections. Journalists from around the world sent him questions, and he responded with sharp, eloquent, sometimes chilling answers. He never showed remorse, never once said sorry, because in his mind, he wasn't the villain. He was the warning. And here's the disturbing part. Thousands of people agreed with him. The manifesto, published in 1995, became one of the most widely discussed political documents of the decade. Academics dissected it. Extremist groups adopted it. Even environmental movements borrowed language from it. His ideas outlived the headlines. Because whether you agree with his actions or not, Ted Kaczynski forced a conversation most people were afraid to have. What if technology isn't making us free? What if it's making us dependent? Small? Controlled? That's the real horror of this story. Not just the bombs, but the uncomfortable truths buried between them. The Unabomber didn't just attack people. He attacked our assumptions. He made us question everything. Our phones, our systems, our blind faith in progress. And whether we like it or not, he was right about one thing. You can live in a cabin in the woods, cut off from society, surrounded by trees, books, and silence, and still reached the entire world with 56 pages and a typewriter. Ted lived out the rest of his years in ADX, becoming a strange cult figure in corners of the internet. In 2021, he was diagnosed with terminal cancer. 2 years later, on June 10, 2023, he was found dead in his prison cell. Some say it was suicide. Others claim he simply let go. But however you spin it, the Unabomber died the same way he lived. Alone, silent, unrepentant. But the echoes of his story, they're still ringing. In every conversation about surveillance, in every debate about AI, automation, and technological overreach, in every question that starts with, "What are we becoming?" This was more than a manhunt, more than a criminal case. This was a mirror. And if you stare into it long enough, you start to ask yourself, how far would someone go to be heard in a world that never stops talking? You might not like the answer, but you'll never forget it. If you felt chills during this story, if you had to pause and ask yourself, what would I have done? Then you're not alone. That's why we tell these stories. Not to glorify the criminal, but to confront the uncomfortable. Like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell, because in the next story, we're diving even deeper into the darkest corners of the human mind. See you there.